Let me just get my slides on before I start. And you can let me know if my screen is fine.
Yes, it's in full screen view.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining the session today. So as Dinesh mentioned, my name is Lucia Skumi. I'm a senior customer consultant for research intelligence at Elsevier. And my role is to basically support researchers in evaluating research performance using our tools such as Scopus, Cyval, and Pure. So in part today, we will be focusing on activities that follow after the manuscript has been complete. So that is, where to publish the research you have completed and written up, or more accurately, where not to publish. So that's why we'll be focusing on predatory journals. Then we're also going to talk about the role of research metrics in choosing a journal in which to publish, and the meaning of research metrics. And finally, then how to promote your research. So as part of this, a big focus today will be on predatory journals and how to avoid them. So very simply, you can see there, we're going to start off with predatory journals, then we're going to go onto the role of research metrics, a little bit wider than only journal metrics, but also the role of journal metrics and how they help you to differentiate between the quality of journals. And then we're going to look at the importance of research visibility and promotion and what you as a researcher can do in that regard. So I want to start off with, where we left off yesterday, because yesterday we talked about journal publishing or article publishing. So I want to just get some feedback from you, because I think before we start talking about predatory journals, we need to have a very clear understanding about what is a legitimate journal. And I think that was addressed very nicely yesterday. So let me just activate the poll and give me your feedback in terms of when you submit your manuscript to a journal, what is it that you expect from that journal? What would you consider as legitimate? So if you can see the poll, just give me your feedback there. And you can select multiple options. Okay, so I can see many people are voting. More than half have voted now. Thanks for that. Okay, 63% have given feedback. Thanks so much. Just give it a minute and then we can end the poll and you can see how everyone's responded. Right, so it seemed to be slowing down. So let's get to 75% and then I'll close the poll. Okay, there you go. And I'll share the results. Yeah, so it looks like many of you were in yesterday's session, because if you look at, all the different options mentioned, the strongest came through as there's a peer review system in place. Right, so that is definitely one of the most, if not the, if it's not the most important factor. Okay, so let me just close this. Right. So all of the activities basically that were listed in this poll are indicative that a journal is legitimate. So looking at, they should be with the journal, there should be clear aim and scope of the journal, should be demarcated well. The editorial board members must be subject specialists, they must be verifiable, there must be control measures, or usually there's control measures for ethical plagiarism. And things like that are in place. There's a peer review system is in place. The journal is indexed by prominent indexing services. There's basic editing, typesetting, and quality control is performed by the journal. Copyright is clarified, archiving and persistent access is in place. In other words, legitimate journals perform many activities to ensure that the research they publish is accurate, that it complies with scientific method, that they present the best possible quality format and ensure that it is retrievable on the long term. So, and in short, before we look more deeply into predatory journals publish articles without doing these activities. But let's dive deeply into what all of this entails. So looking at the origins, if we started, where did this all start? The origin is that the term predatory was basically coined by Jeffrey Beall. I'm sure by now everybody's aware of it. Jeffrey Beall was a librarian at the University of Colorado in Denver, and it dates back to 2010 when he started noticing that there were so-called publishers that were taking advantage of the open access system, whereby authors pay an article processing fee, and then they don't perform the editorial and the review processes that you would expect of a legitimate journal. And he argued that because these journals typically do not undertake these activities like peer review, they are able then to accept large numbers of manuscripts. So they have a very short turnaround time, and hence they make a lot of money because they publish in high volume. So his point was that they're predatory and that these publishers are in business of defrauding scientists and scholars. His definition for predatory was that they are journals that prey on scholars to submit their manuscripts for the sole purpose of making money from these scholars. The website that he created to call these so-called publishers out and the so-called journals out has been archived. It's still available, but he had to close down his website in 2017. We're not sure exactly why. At the moment, it's still being updated by some anonymous members. But Beall was often also criticized for being opposed to open access and that he was trying to undermine open access, and not everyone agreed with the criteria that Beall used. So since, even though this is where it started, and he was the unofficial watchdog to call out publishers that are not doing their job and are really defrauding scientists, since then a lot of research has been done to define predatory publishers or predatory journals more accurately. And in 2019, November 2019, Nature actually, the journal Nature reported that a group of researchers had met to define what predatory publishing actually is. And if anyone thought that this is very simple and that you can quickly identify them, unfortunately, this is not the case. So what this group of researchers that came together in Ottawa, Canada, they sat together, and it's since known now as the Ottawa Declaration, and they came up with this definition that predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and or the use of aggressive, indiscriminate practices for soliciting research, right? So when we talk about prioritize self-interest, we're talking in that there's a focus on making money, expense of scholarship, indicates that there are activities to verify and follow scientific method are not performed. To attract submissions, they send out spam emails and they provide misleading information on their website. So they pretend to be legitimate journals, but they don't perform the activities that a legitimate journal would perform. So what are these characteristics and what are these activities? So how in this group of researchers also identified some of the characteristics whereby you can identify journals that are predatory. So not one single characteristic would identify or would indicate that a journal is necessarily predatory, but there are definitely flags and there are matters of concern. So looking first at providing false or misleading information, and this is usually on the website. So they have misrepresentation of the editorial board. They would have members of the editorial board that are not necessarily really part of that editorial board, and it is not verifiable who they are and where they are located. They would have fake indicators, incorrect addresses, false claims of indexing, and I'm going to show you some examples of these, or membership of associations. They have misleading claims about doing peer review. Another characteristic is deviation from best editorial and publication practices. So they would be unprofessional. Often the website would just be unprofessional with spelling errors, grammar mistakes, and irrelevant text, often copy-pasted. And these also should raise red flags. Then there's lack of transparency. So often little or no information about editorial decisions, how they're made, what the fees are, how the peer review works, whether there is peer review, absent contact information, no details about the article processing charges. The editors or of the editorial board are often unverifiable. And then they also mentioned that there's aggressive emails, spamming, and also repetitive sending of emails to researchers to try to get them to submit publications. And they would use language that is not really associated with editors, how an editor would reach out to an author. So excessive flatterings often, and when it's a clear warning sign is that when the invitee's expertise is outside of the journal scope. So inviting an author to submit or a student to submit to a journal that is completely outside of their field. So these are the characteristics. This is not all of them. It's not exhaustive, but these are some of the most definite identifiers of that it could be a predatory journal. So just looking out for some of these red flags, what do they look like in practice, right? So one of them is the spamming. I think most of us have been exposed to this, receiving an email from a so-called editor asking for a submission of your manuscript. It would look something like on the screen. They would often use flattering or personalized greetings, refer to you as an esteemed researcher. They would refer often to abstracting and indexing services that are not abstract and indexing services like BioX, YZ. It might be a preprint server or anything that they're referring to, but it's not really an abstracting service. And then there would be no academic information often. So there would be sometimes a name and a position, but no real verifiable information that this is a real editor and a real journal. So as I mentioned, these are red flags or clues, not necessarily evidence of the predatory activity. So often some of these characteristics need to add up in order for it to be a predatory journal or considered as a predatory journal. Next example is where there's indication of offering quick publication. So here you can see there's indication here of immediate acknowledgement, urgent review, and publication within 48 hours. So yesterday we talked about the peer review process. This is by no means a process that can happen within 48 hours. So any indication of quick publication should definitely be suspect. Also here referring to multiple indexing and abstracting services like Google Scholar, which is not an index, it's a search engine, Index Copernicus, Research Bible, WorldCat, exactly. Here, for example, so many almost made up names and made up sources here being listed as indexing and abstracting, and this is to mislead the researcher to think this is a prestige journal, perhaps. Then an indication, very upfront indication of the publication fee they mentioned in US dollars. Next example here is in terms of the branding. So this is a little bit suspect if you look at this website of the journal, is that it is using normal images from the internet. It's clip art basically that is put together to act as a brand image. You can see some garbage characters here, which indicates often that it's been copy pasted. There's lack of transparency on this website. It's not indicated who the editorial board is, what is the name of the editor. So all of these, add up to be very suspicious. Then the next example here again, we have a stock photo which is being used. This is actually, just taken from a library photo. And then also using fake or false impact factor, so false metrics being used to create the impression that the journal has prestige. And then the last example we have here is looking at, if you look at, I hope you can see it nicely on the screen, but the type of article, so the aim and the scope of the journal. It says in terms of the scope, it accepts all the types of articles, and that's from research papers to review papers to dissertation chapters, research proposals, MTech, ME, PhD thesis. So this is really ridiculous in terms of the scope of types of material that it will publish. And then it also tries to confuse, if you look at the indexing that is mentioned, it's trying to confuse the author using terminology such as cite factor, which is, there's no such thing as a cite factor. It's made up of cite score and journal impact factor, which are two different metrics used by Scopus and by Web of Science. Also JIF factor, it's not JIF factor, it's just journal impact factor. So deliberately trying to confuse authors who are not so familiar with these metrics, for example. So these are just a few examples of what it looks like in practice and how carefully one should look at the website of a journal to establish that this is misleading information that is presented. So of course now the question is so what to do? And there are lists of predatory journals. There's the Beale's list, which has been archived. So Beale is not updating that website, but there are anonymous authors that have started updating another list, or they started the one with the hashtag update. There's Cabell's, which is a subscription-based list where mostly libraries subscribe to the list, and they do research on journals, and they make the list available for researchers to check against this list whether a journal is predatory or might be predatory. Then there are other lists like the Dolos list. There's I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the Skin organization also has a list. And there's the predatoryjournals.com, there's this list. And this is a small fraction of the lists of predatory journals that are available. And so I want to make the point that it's probably not sustainable or feasible to keep abreast of all these lists. So I want you to convey there are lists, and there's a definite effort within the researcher community and the publishing community to make researchers aware of predatory journals, to call them out and to publish lists of them. But there are many of such lists, and there's no one single list that covers all the predatory journals. So be aware of them, but a more sustainable option or feasible option, I would say, is to rather focus on those indexes that actually do curation, and I'll come back to that. That do curation on journals to make sure that they are not predatory, and do the indexing of those. So what to do otherwise than that is the default position when approached to submit a paper to a journal. Always be suspicious, because this is not normal practice for journals to do. They do not usually send emails and ask authors to submit manuscripts unless it is a special edition. It's very unusual to do this. So be suspicious when you get an email like that. Also consult a senior colleague, because often it is a younger, less experienced researchers that are targeted. So consult senior colleagues, ask them for their advice before you actually select this journal in which you send your manuscript. Also, keep in mind all of those signs that I mentioned earlier, and this would require going to the website of the journal. And most often, or always, you need to go to the website, because you need to familiarize yourself with the aim and scope of the journal, in any case, to make sure that your manuscript is a perfect fit for that journal. So when you're on the website, just make a check for all of those factors that I've mentioned earlier. Then as a general rule, just aim to publish in the top journals in your field, and where to find them is typically they are indexed in international indexes like Scopus, like Web of Science, and the Directory of Open Access Journals. So these are sources or indexes that you can trust. So just looking more into, why you can trust these, because they are curated lists of journals. And I just want to mention, I'm going to use Scopus as an example here of what we do at Scopus in terms of ensuring that there are not predatory journals indexed in Scopus. Right? So firstly, there's a curation process that takes place whereby journals apply to be indexed in Scopus, and they go through a selection process, and they have to comply with a set of 17 criteria before they get indexed. Then there's revaluation. So every journal is automatically reevaluated, because we have had situations where journals started out as legitimate and they became predatory over time, taken over by a new publisher, or whatever is the case, but they become predatory over time. So journals are reevaluated consistently. So once a journal goes through this process, and they are identified as not on standard anymore, and the process then reveals that it is a predatory journal, or basically not meeting up to the standards of Scopus criteria, then it is discontinued, and these discontinued journals are also published in a separate list called the list of discontinued sources, which is available on the Scopus website as well. So this is quite a process that Scopus has in place to ensure that journals are not predatory, and some of the other sources that I mentioned, like the Directory of Open Access Journals and Web of Science, I'm sure also have similar processes in place. More help in this regard is a very useful website, Think, Check, and Submit. And this website guides authors in terms of what are the kinds of decisions or the questions that you should be asking while you are trying to identify a journal in which to publish. So I can really recommend thinkchecksubmit.org. Use this website. It's a collaboration between multiple publishers and representatives from international organizations to help researchers make that decision and provide guidelines about how to identify trusted sources. Right, so looking at the consequences. Right, so the first obvious negative consequence of predatory journals is that a young scholar then builds up, if you are not vigilant and you do publish in predatory journals, you build up over time a CV which is shown to be consistent with predominantly articles in predatory journals that are questionable. And in the long term, then this definitely will affect your academic career and the possibilities for promotion, advancement, and fundraising. So it will become increasingly difficult for you to get funds to continue your research. So this is a very obvious, it really taints the image of the researcher and will limit the career options. For an institution also, when it becomes clear that academics at certain universities consistently engage in these journals, unethical research and publication in predatory journals, but also other unethical practices, the image of the university is then also tainted. So these are some of the very obvious consequences, but I would also like to hear from you what other consequences you think there are in terms of predatory journals. So let me just get your feedback on those. What other consequences do you see for publishing in predatory journals? Okay, so more than 60 voted. Okay, just 60 seconds, and I'll close the poll. Okay, let me end the poll and share with you the results. So there you can see reputational cost for the work and the people involved is extremely important. So that's one of the biggest negative consequences there, of course. But in general, where your research results are published affects the visibility and the impact of your research significantly. And then when you publish in these in a bad journal or predatory journal, all of these others are some of the negative consequences. So there's definitely monetary costs, because research is not free. And often it's very expensive to do research. It's time, and time is money as well. So all the time that you've spent in doing that research, and it's not published in a legitimate journal, so it will not be cited, it will not contribute to the prestige of the university, the prestige of the research. It will not contribute to science in general. So that's a real monetary cost. Reputational cost we've spoken about, definite big danger for researchers when applying for promotion, rating, funding, where your research is scrutinized. This will count against you. Negative impact on rankings. World University rankings exclude journals that they are aware of that are predatory. The durability, so it's in any case not going to be these. Most of these publishers don't have any system in place or any processes in place to make your paper available on the long term, and really such a waste of time and effort, because it's not really contributing to your career, and it's not making a real contribution to science, because it will not be acceptable amongst researchers. So very important there in terms of making the right decisions in terms of where to publish. So I've added, we're going to share the slides, and I'm going to make these references and some more resources available. But at this stage, I'd rather, just hear some of the questions. So we have a few minutes to do a few questions before we go on to talking about research metrics. I don't know, Dineshri, can you maybe highlight some of the questions? I wasn't able to follow that.
Okay, no problem. I think Mary is also on with us today, so she's also here. So whoever would like to answer the question. Mm-hmm. So the first question is: have any predators been brought to book?
Yes. So there's actually, I can answer that one. So there's actually a good example of it, of Omex that was taken to court by a researcher from the US. They were fined something to the extent of $50 million US. Yes, it took quite an effort, because it is, legal action had to be taken by an individual researcher with the support of his university, and this publisher was brought to book. Yes, so that's one example that we are aware of.
Is it possible,
Mary, if Mary has more examples? I'm not sure.
No, I don't have any. I think that's a good one to share.
Okay, I'll move on to the next. Is it possible that predatory journals might also be included in the list of accredited journals?
Yes, I can answer that. So it has happened. It has happened that they make their way in. So if you looked at some of the examples that I showed just now, those are some of the extreme examples. But many of these predatory publishers are very clever in terms of really setting up a website that looks legitimate. And then it is very difficult to actually call them out and know that they are predatory, despite all the checks that are done. So they have made their way into indexes, and for the past few years, the international indexing services have become much more vigilant in catching them out. So it's fewer and fewer cases actually make them into international indexes, and when they are discovered, they are discontinued immediately. But because they have become so clever in disguising their real objectives. We also rely a lot on feedback from researchers and librarians specifically to also, make us aware if they see that a journal is predatory, and that we can, so that we can take action against that.
Okay, thanks, Lucia. I think I'll combine this question. Can you comment on whether Google Scholar, Elsevier, MPDI may have predatory journals indexed on any of these systems? Could there be a possibility?
Right, so Elsevier is the publisher that we're representing at the moment. So I'm very clear that they will definitely not be predatory journals published by Elsevier. MPDI is also a publisher, and they have been under some scrutiny. So I can't and I don't want to comment on specific publishers actually. So I'm not aware of any there. And then Google Scholar is basically a search engine. So you will probably find predatory journals in Google Scholar, because Google Scholar doesn't do any curation. They basically harvest material from other sites. So there's no selection or criteria that is used. So you should be careful when you just use Google Scholar and trying to identify journals using Google Scholar. So I'm not saying that Google Scholar, all the journals, definitely not, are predatory, but it's more likely that you will find, because there's no curation in place. It's basically a search engine only.
Okay. And if an editor should use a Gmail account, would that be considered a red flag?
No, not necessarily. There are countries and circumstances where the editor would be using a Gmail account. So I don't think that would necessarily indicate. But if you look at other criteria or other, and it all adds up, then you should be suspicious. But I think that as a single criteria would definitely not identify a journal as predatory.
Okay. I've seen most international journals indicate the date of submission and date of acceptance. Is it a warning sign if this information is not available?
I wouldn't say that is one of the criteria. I think it's also important to differentiate that there are also journals that are not that established, so new journals, and where the editorial board is still, new, I would say, and not that experienced. So journals also start and they develop and they become more sophisticated, and adding that kind of information is really, adds a lot of value to the journal. But if it is not available on the journal, I wouldn't necessarily see that as a warning sign at all.
So I'm going to combine again a couple of questions. The basic question is, if a journal doesn't appear on Scopus, would it be considered predatory? And is there any way that a predatory journal may have its own DOI?
So the first question, if it's not in Scopus, it's not necessarily predatory at all. So there are many journals that a journal has to be at least 2 years old, for example, and it has to meet a lot of criteria. And there are many journals that have just not applied to be in Scopus. So if it is not included in Scopus, it doesn't necessarily indicate that the journal is predatory at all. So that would not be a criteria. So the other way around is that if you do use Scopus, the journals that you do find in Scopus, those you can definitely trust because they have gone through the selection criteria. If it's not in Scopus, then you'll have to do your own investigation into the journal, sorry, and look at all those red flags that I mentioned earlier to reassure yourself that the journal is legitimate. The second part of the question, sorry, I've forgotten what the second part was.
If predatory journals have a DOI.
Yes, I'm sure there's some of them that do have DOIs. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure it could be. I don't know, Mary, if you have experience with. I don't think DOI is is a clear indicator that the journal is legitimate.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. So some predatory journals do have DOIs for the articles. The organization that provides DOIs and they don't do any checks into the quality or legitimacy of the publishing groups, and they probably shouldn't. That's not their role. So there are predatory journals with DOIs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a legitimate journal.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary and Lucia. Lucia, do you have time for any more questions, or do you want to proceed?
Oh, I think we'll have to move on. Otherwise, we won't be, have time, and maybe get back at the end if there are any other questions that we can still address, or maybe we can address them, in the chat or in the Q&A.
Okay.
App. Thanks for those questions, and you can also reach out to us by email if we can't. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through all the questions. So I see a mention there of the sound, so I hope the sound is still okay. I'm going to move on. So the next topic that we wanted to address here in terms of this series of the author workshop is to talk about research metrics. We often get a lot of questions about research metrics. And once again, before we get into that, just let me know. I want to get a sense of where you are in terms of research metrics, and just a quick poll there. So in terms of which of the following research metrics do you find most useful to evaluate research? So when you're looking at a researcher, at a journal, at an institution, what research indicators are valuable for you? And there you go. Right, so another few seconds, then I'm going to close the poll. Okay, ending the poll. And I just want to thank you so much for participating. It's really very interesting to get the feedback. So you're indicating here that the metrics that you use find most useful is the number of citations, right? So this is real, citations are a form of validation of research. So excellent. But each of these research metrics actually, give you a different perspective of research performance. And also it is important not to look at only one indicator, but also to look at a combination of them. And I'll come back to that when we talk about, oh, sorry, I haven't shared, have I shared the results? Did you see? Yeah, so number of citations, really very high, number of publications, so that's productivity, citations giving you more insight into the impact of the research that is being validated by other researchers. Downloads also important, and we'll come to the other metrics now as we go along. So let me just close this. And yeah, so looking at research metrics, the units and the sources of research metrics are often very confusing. So when we look at research metrics now, the very basic units that we usually work with are the publication counts, because they give us a sense of the productivity of a research entity. And we're talking now about researchers, we're talking about institutions, we're talking about countries. So these units of measurement can be used across different entities, and they can tell us something about a researcher, a country, an institution, etc., a research team even, right? Citations, the number of times researchers refer or cite a publication, is very useful measure of the level of attention within scholarly publishing. So more and more we're talking, when we talk about impact, we also go beyond academic impact, but citations are a very clear indication of academic impact of research. And then also a host of new metrics or alternative metrics. We try not to talk about them as alternative metrics anymore, because they're not that alternative. They're quite mainstream now, which also gives us a level of attention received in social media and other platforms. So an indication of how useful information is outside of the scholarly publishing environment. And this is also a very good early indication of the possible intention to cite a publication. So the fact that when a publication is downloaded, or viewed, we know that there's interest in that research, and the possibility that a citation will come within time is a high probability. We also have patent references, etc. So very basic. These are the units of researchers, of research measurement. And then when you look at where they come from, publication counts and citations, they usually come from Elsevier Scopus, from Web of Science. And those two indexes, as I've already mentioned, they are curated indexes. So they cover only peer-reviewed literature that have gone through a selection process, so that we're very clear that they comply with the definition of scientific publication, and that that it has been peer reviewed. But there are also other sources that also provide metrics, like Dimensions and Google Scholar, which also gives us publication counts and citations. The differentiation there is that it's not focused only on peer-reviewed articles. And then we get alternative metrics, the two main sources. There are others. I'm really simplifying. We can't go into too much depth in these 2 hours that we have, but the two main providers of alternative metrics, or the new, more societal interest indicators, are from Plum Analytics, which is integrated in Scopus, for example, and there's also Altmetric, which is also a provider or aggregator of this kind of information. Quite interesting that Altmetric, the company, and the metrics also, the name is a little bit confusing there. But these are the main sources of research metrics. We're not going to, in this session, going to go into societal impact. We're not saying that it's not important, but societal impact measurement is a lot more complex, a lot more difficult to quantify, and a lot more that we have to take into account, and it calls for a separate session. So please note that we're looking at academic research metrics here, but we're not ignoring the fact that trying to show societal impact is, of course, also very important for research. Then what are research metrics and what are they used for? So there are, as I mentioned now, there are quantitative tools that help us assess the volume, the quantity, and the impact of research outputs. And this really then helps researchers to understand the standing of their work within the context of other researchers, to benchmark their career progress, to assert their value as researchers, or to use for grant applications or for CVs, right? So the use of these metrics very often in making funding decisions, providing evidence for promotion or job applications, also for journal selection, used in university rankings, benchmarking of researchers, research groups, universities, etc. The types of research metrics it's also simplified, but just to differentiate between the different types of metrics on an entity level, we can differentiate between metrics, research metrics that are focused on the researcher. So saying something about the performance of a researcher. So that would be including the H index, the citation count, the output number of that researcher, things like citations per paper. This is very simplified now because all of these metrics have a lot of derivatives. You get top percentiles, shares of international collaboration, etc. So, but the basic indicators used for researchers, then including H index, citation count, output, and then citations per publication or per paper. On the source level, so looking at journals, a different set of metrics used. Here we find a CITE score, which is used in Scopus. We have impact factor, which is also very well known, and I'll go into more detail as we go along. And then also normalized journal metrics like source normalized impact per paper, and then the Scamargo journal rank. I'll go into more detail on those. On the article level, here we look at, usually when we talk about an article, the metrics that we use is the citation count, the number of views, the number of downloads, and social media. So how many times has it been tweeted, is it shared, is it posted? So a little bit oversimplified, but just to differentiate that that metrics are used for different entities, and they can be used on a single entity, and they can also be aggregated up to the level of a group of researchers, an entire institution, an entire country, for example. So looking quickly then at a researcher. So I'm using this example from Scopus. So this is a researcher profile, Professor Abdul Karim. I hope he doesn't mind that I'm using his profile as an example. It's quite impressive. So you can see for Professor Abdul Karim, the typical kind of metrics that we use for a researcher indicated here on the left-hand side is the number of documents that is published, the number of citations that is received for his publications, and then his H index. So in this case, we have an H index of 63. And the H index is an equation based on the number of publications and the number of citations per publication. So a scientist then has an H index of 9. If his top 9 most cited publications have each received 9 citations, or in this case of Professor Abdul Karim, he has 36 of his top publications, top meaning the top cited, have reached at least 63 citations each, right? So this is a composite indicator which tells us something about the productivity of the researcher as well as the impact of the researcher as indicated through the citations, right? So in the same breath, I need to say that the H index was developed in 2005. It was quite revolutionary in terms of it's always been very difficult for researchers to really quantify, their productivity and their impact. So when the H index came along, everybody was elated, and now we have just this one single number which we can use to show, our value as a researcher. But since then, there's been a lot of criticism of the H index, and it should be used very carefully because it is not normalized. So researchers in one subject area, say biosciences or biomedical sciences, for example, they publish a lot more than researchers, for instance, in the arts and humanities and in the social sciences. So it shouldn't be used to compare researchers that are in different fields. It also doesn't take into account that researchers have been publishing for different time periods. So that's also something that should be taken into consideration. So when using the H index, just use it very, very carefully. Moving on to article level metrics. So article level metrics then tell us something about the interest in a specific article. And here we usually, and this is one of the articles, I hope you can see it well, because it is quite interesting that one of the articles of Professor Abdul Karim really indicates that it has high academic impact. So it's been cited a lot in international indexes, but it has also been, very active also in terms of the social media platforms. So there are usage indicators are things like clicks and views and downloads. There are captures indicating that it's been bookmarked, that it's been added to favorites. There are mentions. It was blog. There were blog posts related, news mentions. In some cases, I'm not in this specific case, if it was used to update Wikipedia, social media would count here in terms of tweets, likes, and shares. And then, but also indicating some other citations that come from patents or clinical trials or policies, so on. So really showing societal interest in a specific research article. And researchers often need to identify those articles that have had the highest interest. And this is a nice way of, using metrics to show that your research has been has had high impact academically, but it has also it's had interest beyond academia as well in terms of social media interest. So then moving on to journal level metrics. So here we have a set of different metrics, and I'm again using Scopus here as an example, but there are, of course, and I'll also refer to the impact factor, which is not available in Scopus, but is also very well. And generally, journal metrics are based on the number of citations per article that a journal receives. Right? It's a very simple formula that is used. So in this case here, we have cell generation. In Scopus, we give more information about the journal, how long it's been covered, who's the publisher, what subject areas does it belong to, and then on the right-hand side, you will see the Cite score. So the Cite score is the average number of citations that an article in this journal receives over a 4-year period. So 1.3, that's the average. And then we also have other metrics to indicate more normalized metrics to give a different perspective of the journal as well. So the Cite score is a very simple average citations per article over 4 years. The SNP is the source normalized impact per paper, and that is the average number of citations per article, but normalized by the subject. In other words, the citation is divided by the number of expected citations for that subject area, right? So that you can compare it across different subject areas. And then the SJR, that is the Scimago journal rank, that is the average number of citations again, but the citations there are weighted according to the prestige and the subject of the citing journal, right? So they, in terms of the Scimago journal rank, the argument is that not all citations are equal. If a journal receives a citation from a prestige journal, like say Nature or Science or a Lancet, that would count for more. And if the citation is coming from a subject area that is relevant or linked to the subject area of the journal to which it is citing, then it also is weighted higher, right? So next we'll also look at, so mentioning these, normalized metrics. So Scimago journal rank normalizes by weighting the citations by where it's coming from, and the source normalized impact per paper, the SNP, also normalizes on the subject area. And why is this important? So the factors that influence publication activity, and this should always be kept in mind in terms of when we are using journal or research metrics to compare entities with each other. So always keep in mind that subject matter is a huge, there's a huge difference between the citation culture, the publication culture of different subject areas. As I mentioned, one of them, biomedical sciences, they publish more, they also get more citations, for example, than social sciences and arts and humanities. The theoretical fields, such as mathematics and engineering, also lower than the experimental field, like in the life sciences. So field comparisons, if you across subject areas, always try to use normalized metrics. Then this is relevant where it comes to authors. So the author's age, not the real age, but the length of time that the author has been publishing, that also has an influence, especially in terms of the H index, as I mentioned. Then publication date is important to take into consideration. So when you're comparing metrics, keep in mind when was it published, because it takes time for an article to be cited as well. So that can definitely have a huge influence in the number of citations. And in some subject areas, it takes much longer for publications to be cited than in others. And then the type of publication also has an influence. So publications, say for instance, review articles get more citations than research articles. So there's a difference in terms of type of publication as well. So when we work with research metrics, these should also always be kept in the back of our minds, and try to use normalized metrics wherever possible. Right. So besides the Cite score that I mentioned, which is let me just see if I don't think I have a slide specifically about the journal impact factor, but the journal impact factor goes back longer, and it's very widely used as well. But it's also like the Cite score. Let me just go back to my Cite score slide here, because it's quite, sorry guys, I'm there you go. So here we have the CITE score here. So the journal impact factor is very similar. It's also the number of publications or the number of citations that were published over a 4-year period for the CITE score divided by the number of citations received. But in the case of the impact factor, there's a 2-year window that is taken or a 5-year window. So there are 2 impact factors, impact factor for 2 years and impact factor for 5 years. So the number of citations divided by the number of publications over that period, which gives you an average number of citations. And this then really just helps you to get a sense of the to what extent articles in that journal gets cited, which is a proxy for the quality or the prestige of the journal. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. And then there are derivatives, of course, of CITE score, like the CITE score percentiles. And you also get for the impact factor, you also get percentiles. So these then ultimately help you differentiate between journals in the same field. So CITE score percentiles indicates the relative standing of a serial in its field. A journal, in this case, we have the same journal here, Cell Generation, and it's in the 99th percentile, which means it's in the top 1% of journals in that field. And the title will then receive a CITE score percentile for each subject area in which it is indexed, right? So Cell Generation will fall into different subject areas, for instance. I can't think of exactly, so biomedical sciences, for example, and neurology, I would just a guess. So they would have a different percentile within the different subject areas that they fall into. And the same then, we also get journal quartiles. And quartiles are also use the CITE score, where it is divided into quartiles based on the CITE score or the journal impact factor. So each of the quartiles then represent a 25% band. So quartile 1 would be the titles in the 99th to the 75th percentile. And this would then indicate also, the quality or the prestige of the journal. So if you hear about, or researchers would often mention that they publish in first quartile, or when funders do an evaluation, they would want to see how many articles were published in first quartile journals. So these are all of these metrics, CITE score and the derivatives thereof in terms of percentiles and quartiles, help us to make a differentiation between the quality of journals, right? So I should also mention here that, of course, keep in mind that not all articles in that specific article will have the same rate of citations, and that is also why researchers can't claim a CITE score, or they can't claim a journal impact factor, because they might publish in a journal which has a high impact factor, but that article that they contributed might not be cited at all, right? So this is the impact factor. The CITE score is used purely to differentiate between journals. So this is an example. So in terms of comparing journals, so if you do a search for Zoom fatigue, for example, you want to see which journals are publishing in articles on Zoom fatigue, you would find that there are, just the example, the snapshot there, 5 journals have published articles on Zoom fatigue, but this gives no indication of what the quality is of those specific journals. So on the right-hand side, when you look at the site score of these journals, then you will find that the journal that has the highest site score there is Communications of the Association of Information Systems, right? So just looking at the volume that a journal produces on a specific topic is not an indication of the quality of that journal. You can use the site score or the journal impact factor to make that differentiation. And you can also use other metrics to do that, like Skimago Journal Rank or the SNP. So I hope this has given you an overview of the three main types of journal metrics that are important to keep in mind and how we would use them. And just to close off here in terms of journal metrics, just a question to you. I'm going to launch a poll again to give me your estimation of what is the best journal here. And I've provided the site score for them, and just hear from your side, what would you, knowing now what the site score is, what would you say, and knowing the other journal metrics as well, what is the best journal of these? Right, so I'm going to end the poll now, and then I have to admit here that this was a sneaky question, because the answer is that each of these journals are best in their respective fields, right? So although Nature Genetics, which was indicated here as the highest or the most selected, the site score is not normalized, so we cannot use it to compare journals across different fields, right? So just as a reminder there, so when you're using the site score or you're using the impact factor, just keep in mind that it is not subject normalized, so you can't use it to compare journals across different subject areas. But in terms of identifying Nature Genetics here based on its site score of 20.83, indeed, that is the journal with the highest site score, but it is not the best journal. All of these are best in class or best in their subject areas. Right? So we do have a few minutes for questions, if there are any questions on the metrics part of the session.
Hi, Lucia. Yeah, there are questions, but I see that Mary indicated that there's a few she wanted to answer.
Okay,
so,
good.
I think maybe you can.
Yeah, I clicked that I was hoping Lucia could speak to it, but there were several questions about ResearchGate and how they fit in here. Basically there's a couple asking if ResearchGate and academia have predatory journals. and also one about if ResearchGate can be used as a metric. So I thought, Lucia, if you have context on that, I'll let you answer. Otherwise, I can jump in too. But I thought it'd be useful to address some of the ResearchGate questions coming up.
Right. So ResearchGate. I'm actually not so familiar with exactly what the metrics look like in ResearchGate. The important, I think, factor to keep in mind when you are using ResearchGate is that it is not only including peer-reviewed literature, so it's not only peer-reviewed publications. So it's much broader than that. So it's not there's no inherent quality selection criteria that is built into ResearchGate. It is basically a platform where researchers can share their research, and it can be any research that they've done. It doesn't even have to be, published research. So I would, I would actually just comment in terms of that. But I think within some communities, ResearchGate is very widely used. It is not definitely not associated specifically with with predatory journals for sure, even though there might be predatory journals there, because as I mentioned, there's no inherent quality control selection process that gives you that assurance that the research that you find in ResearchGate is going to be of a specific standard. So I hope that answers, and exactly the same for academia.edu. So if you want to maybe add to that, but that is as far as I know. It's definitely something that you can use, but just keep in mind that there's no inherent quality control behind it.
Okay. I also had another question about the DHET journals. Are Scopus journals DHET accredited journals?
Yes, well, that works both ways. So the Department of Higher Education have accredited 6 different lists of journals or indexes, and that includes Scopus. So Scopus, Web of Science, the Norwegian list, there's a list of South African journals, and there's IBSS, and I'm not sure if there's another one. So those lists are accredited by the Department of Higher Education. So and what that basically means is that when research is published in journals that are on those lists, then the institution that they are linked to will get subsidy for that publication. So that does not, I cannot speak specifically. There might be, or there could be a few predatory journals amongst them, but I'm quite sure that each of these lists are very aware of predatory journals, and they would try to follow up on them and make sure that they are, excluded or removed from those lists as soon as they are picked up. Yeah. So I hope that answers your questions. They are definitely the list of South Africa. Yeah. So the DHET list, or the list of South African journals, they are accredited. Not all of those journals are indexed in Scopus. So.
Okay. Another question is the G index better than the H index?
Yes, that's a good question. So I don't think the G index is better than the H index, but they definitely give you different perspectives of a researcher's work, right? So the G index is basically calculated, or it aims to show where a researcher has had a high number of citations for a specific or for a number of publications, and that doesn't always reflect nicely in the H index. So it would be the most accurate way of using the H index and the G index and the M index. The M index compensates for the age of the researcher or the publishing age of the researcher. So the best practice would be to use all of them, but I wouldn't say it is necessarily a better. It's definitely not as widely used as the H index.
Okay. There was a question earlier. Is there a possibility that predatory journals listed could be on the DOAJ index?
It could happen, but I know for sure that the Directory of Open Access Journals have made a tremendous effort to exclude any predatory journals from their list. So there has been a big cleanup of the DOAJ, as has been with the other indexes. Scopus, definitely Web of Science as well. So for the past number of years, we have become much more vigilant against this. So I think that the DOAJ can definitely be trusted.
Okay, perfect. I'm not sure if Mary can answer this one. Is it possible to withdraw an article from a predatory journal if not yet published?
It's going to depend on the predatory journal, most likely. In theory, it would be great if you could do that. In actuality, if you've signed some sort of paperwork with them, because they don't really follow normal ethical standards of how journals tend to work, they don't really have to let you withdraw your paper. So yeah, it's just going to depend. Lucia, I don't know if you have anything.
Yes, it's very difficult. You can try. The fact that whether they will do it or not it's that we can't really say anything about that. I think what has happened in the past is when you repeatedly try to retract the article or and there's no response, is that you can still submit that article then to another journal, but with communication to the journal editor explaining the situation. And in some cases, the second journal might be accommodating in terms of publishing that article with what you call it, an annotation to indicate that the journal that this article has been published in this journal, but it's been retracted or cancelled or whatever, and that's why it's published here as well. So you could try that route, because often the predatory publishers are not responsive. They don't really care, and so that's another route that you can try to follow.
I also saw a comment from Richard from, I think, one of the universities in Ghana, and he said, no, they will not, because they do not have a retraction policy. So I just thought we could share that. Another general question we've been receiving is, if an author has written an article and they have cited predatory or a predatory journal article, will this negatively impact the author?
Yes, unfortunately it could. So I have been involved with some projects where I saw that, that happened, where there were, applicants for a specific position or applicants for grant funding, where they do actually also look at not only the journals, but also looking at the references that were used. So it is important. It's very difficult, as you can imagine, but because on a journal level, we've looked at some of the characteristics that you can look out for. But if you are using Google Scholar, for example, or a search engine, and you're not really coming to that article from the journal perspective, it's very difficult to really know that it is a predatory journal that you're citing. But unfortunately, it could count against 2 years. It could.
Okay, and most of the questions about metrics we've already answered through typing the answers in chat. I don't see any more questions that haven't been addressed.
While you're looking, I just wanted to mention, because I just noticed now that there was a slide that I had included, which maybe I accidentally deleted, which addressed the responsible use of metrics. So this is also very important. So when using research metrics in terms of quantifying your own work, or looking at somebody else's work or an entity, is to do that in a responsible way, meaning that to keep in mind that a metric only tells part of the story, and you usually need to use more than one metric to tell the full story, or a whole set of metrics. And also the best practice is to always combine it with expert opinion as well. So there are very definite protocols and best practice with regards to using metrics, and you can look specifically. Before we share the slides, I'll make sure that you have references to that, to the Leiden Manifesto, which gives very clear guidelines about how to use research metrics, and also the DORA Declaration, for instance, that also advises against or advises about how to use journal metrics very specifically, and how not to use them. So I'm sorry that I just noticed that I had missed that slide.
No problem, Lucia. The next question, can a predatory journal later be accredited to a mainstream or legitimate journal?
Oh gosh, I've never heard of that. No, I've never come across something like that, but maybe it's not impossible if a journal is taken over by a reputable publisher with a new editorial board, a legitimate editorial board. I assume that could work, but I have no experience of that happening.
Another question, we sometimes find our international students publishing in journals that may be deemed as predatory because their countries may not really worry about such a journal. How adversely can such publications affect you as a co-author? I think that actually has been addressed. But there's one about, if we just, do metrics not in a way make it difficult for emerging researchers to get into the top journals, as they may be concerned about the metrics that they can generate? So I think the question is, do metrics make it difficult for emerging researchers to publish in those journals, I suppose?
Oh, I'm not sure that I follow that question, because metrics are basically metrics. If you're talking about journal metrics, for instance, it tries to guide you in terms of being able to identify top journals, but I mean the metrics cover the whole range of journals. So not emerging researchers, new researchers, they don't start with the top journals. So you would start with say second quartile journals, or even first quartile journals, which are not bad journals, but they don't publish the cutting edge research and then work their way up at it. I think metrics are always a way of helping researchers understand that there's a range of journals, and they indicate a different quality, so that you are aware of that. So I don't think it is, I can't see the negative perspective of that. But I'm not sure I understand the question correctly, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I'm not seeing any new questions that haven't been addressed already. There is just a comment. You did not mention AJOL as part of the databases to use to assess credible African journals. What are your thoughts about it?
Right, so I'm aware of African journals online, but what I'm not aware of is if there's any quality control in terms of the journal. As far as I know, AJOL is a platform for journals where journals are published. But I'm not aware of any quality control that is performed on. I could be wrong. I'm just not aware of, the exact criteria or whether there are criteria for journals for hosting their journals on that platform.
And someone has asked if you could give a simple example about impact factor.
A simple example of an impact factor, right? So impact factor, looking at the screen at the slide that we have on the screen now, where you see the name of the journal and you see the site score. So the site score here, I say it's old example, but the site score here means when you look at 6.49, it means that on average, articles in this journal are cited 6.49 times over a 4-year period. The impact factor has exactly the same formula that it uses, except that it uses a 2-year window, right? So the impact factor would be, say the impact factor would be 2.50, and that would mean that on average articles in that journal is cited 2.5 times over a 2-year period. And there's also a 5-year impact factor as well, which means that it looks at the number of citations over a 5-year period. Does that make sense? Or I can always try to find a better example. Let me just stop sharing and see if I can get a slide that can, I think I had one. Let me just see if I can find it quickly. So let me just share my screen again. So it looks like I do need to just scroll where I have an example. So this is the journal impact factor. So can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So where you see here that it dates back to showing the development of by Eugene Garfield in 1960. The calculation of the impact of a journal is then based on the average number of times the article of a journal is cited in a 2 or a 5-year period, right? So all the citations received in the 2-year period divided by the number of articles or reviews published in the same period. Right. So it also the result of the formula is an average number of citations per article over a 2-year period, opposed to site score where it is over a 4-year period. There are other differences, more detailed differences in terms of, what is counted and what is not counted as documents, but I won't go into that much details at this stage. Is that okay?
Yeah.
In explaining the impact factor.
I think the last question we have, or that has not been addressed is it, if approached to review an article, how do you know if the article is predatory?
Oh, so when you would have to, for the journal that you are reviewing, so the focus would be there then on looking at the journal for which you are reviewing. So usually when you're asked to review an article, it would be for a specific journal. So there's no such thing as a predatory article comes out of a predatory journal. But the article in itself may not be predatory. It might be quite legitimate and then submitted to a journal that is predatory. So based on just the article, I don't think there's there's basically, there's no such thing. There might, so the article might have other problems. It might be plagiarized or not conforming to some ethical factors, but in itself, it is not predatory. But if it is published, but the journal in which it is published, the journal could be predatory. Yeah. So if you get a invitation to review, make sure that you know which journal it is that you are doing this for. And in most cases, if it's a predatory journal, they would most often, they would not do any peer review at all. So you would not receive anything in any case.
Okay, I think that is the end of the questions. So just want to thank Lucia Skumbi for presenting. As always, her presentations are very interesting.
We still have Dineshri. We still have part 3 of that session.
Sorry.
I just wanted to. It's
during the Q&A. Sorry.
Let me just. So we still are just sorry for scrolling, guys. So we're quickly going to. I just have a few slides also on. On visibility. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling. Oh, sorry. I'm not sure how to go back. Okay, so I'm going to skip this poll because we're running out of time and jump right into visibility and, the importance of visibility because after all the effort that you've done in terms of researching and publishing it, you want your research to be found, you want it to be read, used, cited. So, how to make that happen. And then, of course, it also helps in terms of motivating for funding applications because funders mostly evaluate funding proposals based on the experience and the merit of applicants. So you really want your research to be out there. So how do you do this? So I just got a few examples that I wanted to share with you. And the first thing is search engine optimization, right? Or shortly known as SOE. So this can definitely help your article in terms of appearing higher in the results returned by search engines like Google. So many researchers, of course, use Google or Google Scholar. Search engine optimization is really important. So, using strong keywords in your titles and your headings, that's important. So think about keywords that are really very descriptive and also indicates the trend that you are trying to describe or if there are trends involved. And that is very specific. Also remember that search engines see websites differently. They pay special attention to headings and titles. Also interlink your paper with other content on the web. For example, papers or linking your article with the data repositories where relevant. I'll come back to that again. And make sure that your author information is complete, that it contains all the details of the researchers mentioned, and then finally pay attention to the captions of the images and tables, including strong keywords there as well, really. So titles and subtitles, very important. In the keywords, make sure that you are comprehensive in terms of your keywords that you provide and use those keywords in the abstract as well. make sure that all the metadata is accurate, and very importantly, that there are captions in the images and video descriptions. All of these will just help search engines to pick up your article easier, right? So it will come up high in the search engine results. So that's one strategy, is search engine optimization, right? Another option there is to share your research, right? So authors can share their research at each stage of the publication process, but just keeping in mind that you should keep keep by the rules. So preprints can be shared freely. Author manuscripts can be shared with students and colleagues for their private use, and it can be used in institutional repositories, on personal websites, on preprint services as well. Then looking after publications, if it's open access, you can share it freely. If it's subscription-based, share the link. You can also share it privately or on approved platform, but you cannot add it to ResearchGate, academia.edu, etc., which are public platforms. And then after publication, it can also be shared more widely after an embargo period. So often a publisher will require for the article not to be shared for a certain period, shared freely after before a certain time period has lapsed. In all of these cases, it's good practice to always link to the final version of your article after publication using the DOI. And in all cases, it's also best practice to use a user license such as CC by NC in D, which means that the content can be downloaded, but that the author must be credited, and that the content cannot be changed or used commercially. Yes, so sharing your research, but within those parameters, that's very important. So researcher profiles, of course, your institutional profile at your institution. Most institutions profile their researchers. Make sure that it's up to date. Use that profile. Institutional repository. Add your publications to the institutional repository. That also helps in terms of making it more accessible. There are many search engines that harvest institutional repositories that can pick up your research from that end. And then also your personal website, your blog, keep it updated. There are many researcher profiling systems out there. I'm not going to say which are the best, or which ones to select, but whichever you choose, make sure that you keep it up to date and that you at least use some of them. LinkedIn profile. So this is one of my favorite researchers that I follow on social media. So he's a good example of a LinkedIn profile that is very up to date and very engaging. Really attracts you to come back and follow the researcher and be up to date about what's happening. Also important is to apply for an ORCID. So an ORCID is Open Research and Contributor ID. It provides a persistent numerical ID to researchers to prevent name ambiguity. So this is to prevent that your research is linked to another researcher with a similar name, for example. So the ORCID is similar to ISSN or ISBN. It's a unique numerical number for you as a researcher. So I'm providing the links here. If you don't have an ORCID yet, just click on the link, register, and then you can upload your publications into ORCID. You can also link to Scopus, and you can transfer your publications from Scopus into your ORCID profile, and your ORCID number will then also be added to Scopus, where it will help identifying you as a researcher. The Scopus profile, this is one of the profiles that is automatically generated using an algorithm. But even so, it's good to regularly go back and to make sure that your author profile is correct. So using your researcher profile is very important in terms of ensuring visibility of your research. Personal contact and networking, so presenting your research face-to-face, using conferences, going to invited lectures, really presenting your research. Also, you can do that electronically. You can hold your own webinars and video meetings and talk about your research. Poster presentations are great. It helps you to grow your network. And you can use things like your email signature. I've seen that recently where a researcher has in his signature where he's a reviewer, where he's an editor of an article, his most recent publication or his recent project. And it was really interesting when you come across that to see what the researcher is involved in, and that just really expands your visibility as well. In social media, I think this is quite obvious because it has billions of viewers. So using Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, I don't try to use all of them. I'm sure that's not possible, but your favorite social media platform can definitely be used also to share links to your articles, and then you can use this as your online presence where you can share your views, share what you're researching about. And then also follow influential researchers in your field, engage in discussions there so that people get to know you, get to know what you're working on. A great way is to, when you're researching a specific topic, is to have what they call AMA, Ask Me Anything, and really engage with an audience about your research. Media relations is another one, is when you've completed your research, just create that lay summary, which explains the significance of your research, the outcomes in a lay language, so that it can be shared via press releases or also on social media, where you won't necessarily use academic language. And then this really supports institutions. Many institutions now have media offices where where if it is in this lay summary format, it's easy to share with the public. If it's really interesting research for a wide audience, you can also ask the publisher to support you in creating some publicity around that research. So this is just a small example that I've posted here that I came across. Fruit Fly offers lessons in good taste. So, trying to get something funky, something interesting, do something that would appeal to the public in terms of your research and share that. Another very useful strategy is to link your research data to your publication as well. So also mentioning here, this is an article that appeared recently where a study was done, and they found that that articles which link their data has 25% higher citation impact. Right? So this example then of the graph there on the left-hand side shows, so it's the on the y-axis you have top cited, the top 10% most cited articles, and on the x-axis here you have the international collaboration. The small dot there, those are the US publications which have the data sets linked to them, and you can see that they are performing much higher in terms of the percentage of top cited, and also higher in terms of international collaboration than those articles that are not linking to their data sets. Right? So this is becoming much more common, and in many universities it is also encouraged to share your research data as well. And then finally, I just wanted to share, because I came across this article recently in the University World News, where researchers or professors of the University of Pretoria shared their stories about how they improved their research visibility. So it's not about the specific case here, but in terms of what were the strategies that really helped them to increase their visibility. And the things that they mentioned was international collaboration, very specifically industry collaboration, because that is very applied science, working on very specific problems and coming up with solutions. And that really gave them a lot of visibility as well. Engaging in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research that also attracted a lot of attention to the work that they were doing. They also mentioned that they targeted high impact journals specifically, so they were very conscious of where they were publishing because they wanted to get that wider readership, and they also wanted to attract citations. Also, what they mentioned was to master the art of research, is to really, get a very good understanding of how to do research and expand that to the entire department where there's a good understanding of how to do research. It just makes it so much easier and less painful to the whole publication process as well. They also mentioned in terms of the topics that they were working on is to focus on relevance, contextual and transformative kinds of topics. So also looking at, the environment that you're in at the moment and linking it to specific issues that are important. And then focusing on global issues like poverty, hunger, water, and other issues that are also included in the Sustainable Development Goals. Right? So these are some of the, in terms of, professors that have been very successful in attracting attention to their research, and they did it very deliberately, and these were the strategies that they used. In terms of relevance, also there was a focus in terms of within the field that they were working on in this COVID pandemic was to also think about the topics that they're working on, but from the perspective of what was relevant and contextual at that specific moment. And they were very successful in doing that. So with that, I've concluded. I'm not sure if there's any questions around, this part of the session, really talking about visibility and how to increase some tips and tricks about how to increase visibility for your research. If there are any questions around that?
No, Lucia. Mary and I have answered with the type chatting for the question. Mm-hmm. There's only one question left in chat. Can you say ICI Copernicus is a credible indexer? But I know that's not related to this part of the session. I'm not sure whether you want to take that question.
Yes, I don't feel that I'm really competent enough to answer that question. I have heard several times that it is not, but I cannot really comment on that with with enough knowledge to back it up. So
that's fine. So there's another question. The person is asking about where to find Cited. You can find it on Scopus. It will be available on the Scopus source list as well as on the journal pages on Scopus. I think we have 5 minutes left. I don't see any more questions coming through. Is there anything else you want to add, or any more information you want to share, Lucia?
Not from my side. I'm just showing my face to thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you for participating in the poll. Thanks for making time for this. Please do reach out to us if you have any questions. It's been a pleasure for me.
Thanks so much, Lucia, for your presentation again. And for all those that requested the recording, we are going to make the recording available on our YouTube channel, Elsevier Africa. We're going to share the link with you once it's up. And Lucia, there have also been requests for a copy of your presentation. Will we also be sharing this?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so we will be sharing the slides as well. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon forward.